Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, January 30th, 2021, and today is all about Georgia. Today we're going to be taking a look at the post-election, post-runoff polls that have been taken in the state of Georgia. Specifically, this poll that was taken, the University of Georgia sent out a survey to people in the state of Georgia. They pretty much asked them their positions on a number of super important, races and, not necessarily races, super important political figures. We're talking Brian Kemp, we're talking Donald Trump, Jon Ossoff. You can see my picture up actually in the top right corner of the screen. Didn't even realize that, but, I'm sure many of you guys already know what I look like, and that's me in front of the Capitol building. But, so let's go ahead and take a look at the approval rating, of a bunch of different prominent figures within the state of Georgia specifically, and of course those who are known on the national level. We're going to go from Trump to Biden to Ossoff to Warnock to Abrams to Kemp to Raffensperger to the Democratic Party to the GOP. So there's a lot that we need to cover because I think Georgia could be a state that reflects the new coming Democratic Party. And Georgia went to Joe Biden on the presidential level, but it was the closest state that Joe Biden won in the entire electoral map. Georgia was decided by 0.23%. It was exceptionally narrow. 5 million people cast their ballots, nearly 5 million. We're talking 4.995. And Joe Biden won by a margin of 12,000 votes in the state of Georgia. Now, the reason why this was such a big deal was because the last time Georgia had gone to a Democrat was not Barack Obama, was not John Kerry, was not Al Gore, but rather Bill Clinton in his first election. And the only victory that arose in Georgia was a result of Ross Perot being on the ballot. Georgia was still a very conservative state, and I would argue Bill Clinton was also a very conservative president and candidate. But Georgia narrowly voted for Bill Clinton back then by 0.59%. For 28 years, it had voted for the Republican Party till now. So looking at Georgia, this is a state Democrats were very pleasantly surprised to win, because they did not expect to win Georgia. It was always in discussion. I predicted personally that Georgia would go blue, so sort of a self-brag there, but also I got North Carolina and Florida right, so it sort of cancels wrong, but it sort of cancels out. But I said Georgia was going blue. Not many people, predicted Georgia to go blue. I believe 538 said that Joe Biden would be, the favorite in Georgia, but a lot of the betting markets, every single one of them, had Georgia red. A lot of mainstream media pundits said, Georgia's probably going to go red. I know everyone's expecting it to go blue or at least be competitive, but Donald Trump will likely end up in the positive. And I think this, had Donald Trump just narrowly outperformed what he did, he probably would have won Georgia. He probably would have won the election. But the cards fell, and Donald Trump ended up losing the election. And I think that Georgia definitely deserves a lot of attention, not only because of the result on the presidential level, but also on the result of the Senate level. Georgia gave the Democratic Party the majority in the United States Senate. Before Georgia, the runoff elections here, the Democrats only had 48 seats. The Republicans had 50. All the Republican Party needed to do was carry one out of the 2 seats they already held. They held 2 seats. The Republicans had a 52-48 majority by party composition after the 2020 election, before the Georgia runoffs. Well, once those 2 seats were vacated, and Democrats were able to run candidates there. Jon Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, they came from the runoff. Democrats ended up defeating both Republican incumbents in the state of Georgia, even after Joe Biden was elected. In fact, the margin of victories here for Democrats was higher than it was for Joe Biden, considerably higher. Raphael Warnock outperformed Joe Biden by nearly 2,000%, nearly 1,000%. That's super significant. So now, all eyes on Georgia. All eyes on Georgia, and we actually have some very interesting post-election data to take a look at, because this could be an indicator as to how some other states that were previously Republican states that became competitive, if not gone to Joe Biden in the presidential election, Arizona, in the same boat. And I think Georgia is a state Republicans are really trying to reclaim in 2022, because Raphael Warnock, not Jon Ossoff, will be up in 2022, but he won by 2% in the runoff election. So that's not a super significant amount. Republicans are going to try to say, this 2% means that Republicans can win it back. But the approval rating of the GOP and Donald Trump is not too high. So it really all comes down to who they nominate. But let's take a look. Georgia voters Do you strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, or strongly disapprove of the way Donald Trump handled his job as president? Those who strongly approve, 28.9%. Those who somewhat approve, an additional 11.3%. Where does that put them? Well, that actually adds up to 40.2%. You see, those who strongly disapprove, 47.9%, add an additional 9. That's 57% to 43%. 57% to not even really 43%. It's 40.2%. So looking at the amount of voters that disapprove of Donald Trump, he's overall here now in the net negative by 17 points in the state of Georgia. Very interesting. We can compare that to Joe Biden's performance in this state in just a moment. Now, they asked the question about Brian Kemp. They talk about this. I've actually averaged this all out. No need to go, by strongly approve, somewhat strongly again. We'll get into it. We know it. You can see it here. You can add it up yourself. But essentially, Brian Kemp at negative 9 points. Now, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, someone who upheld the Georgia presidential results, argued with Donald Trump, someone who Donald Trump called and said, please find 11,000 votes so he can be in the victory. Well, people approve of him by 13 points. He's liked. They have questions about the Georgia General Assembly. Then they ask questions about Joe Biden's transition. A lot of people approve about that. That's not exactly his job performance. They ask about how they think that things are going to go. They ask about whether or not people voted. How did you vote in the presidential election? Do you believe there was widespread voter fraud? The overwhelming majority say absolutely not. So let's go ahead and see if we can find the question about Joe Biden, because I think that's something that's much more important about the way that Georgia could vote in the midterm elections and the way that they already view Joe Biden's first few days of the presidency. So let's go ahead and keep scrolling. I know that this is taking just quite a bit to take a look for where Joe Biden actually is, but let's go ahead and see. They asked the questions about 2000, and here we go. Overall, do you have a favorable and unfavorable impression of Joe Biden? So this isn't directly related to his job approval. When they talk about favorability, they talk about whether or not you approve of someone as a person. But considering that his first few days definitely have been dominated a lot, I would say that, a job approval rating might be in time for, or could be done. But for right now, we're looking at a favorable versus unfavorable impression of Joe Biden. But that's pretty much all you can get for the, leading up to the days of the first few, the first few weeks of the presidency. But, Joe Biden in the positive here by 11 points amongst Georgia voters. So it's clear here that they disapprove of the way Donald Trump handled his job as president. I can't imagine they'd approve of him more than they approved of his job. So I would actually think a favorability rating would show Donald Trump in a much worse position. Brian Kemp at negative 9, Joe Biden at plus 11. Joe Biden matching Brad Raffensperger in the state of Georgia. So I think that, Georgia definitely changing the way that they're looking at, Joe Biden and, other Democrats. But I also want to point out that, I'm not necessarily surprised given that Georgia has definitely been a state that's been targeted by Trump legal team, been mentioned as a state that is, rampant, widespread voter fraud, whatever it might be. That argument has been made and has gone, never worked, but definitely targeted a lot of voters in the state of Georgia. And they misspelled John Ossoff's name here, but I guess if they're asking the poll via, phone number, then it really doesn't make a difference when you're talking about John versus John. You wouldn't know how I pronounced versus the spelling. But overall, John Ossoff in the positive by 10 points. I find that very interesting. He's someone who is liked by the voters in the state of Georgia. I mean, it makes sense. He was just elected by them, but they also, there are still 11% of people who say they don't know. So once it starts to average out, it'll probably be closer. But for right now, he starts out plus 10. I find that very interesting, but I'm not too surprised. A newly elected senator, people are going to be optimistic. Raphael Warnock in a higher favorability rating, plus 17 statewide. Very interesting. I think that's something, newly elected senator, someone who ran against Kelley Loeffler, the alternative definitely seemed very different than Raphael Warnock. And if voters caught on to that difference, it's likely that they ended up viewing Raphael Warnock at a much more favorable opinion, after the election. They also asked the question about Stacey Abrams, a potential governor bid in 2022. We could see from her, she's ahead, plus 10 statewide. Keep in mind, Donald Trump minus 17, Brian Kemp minus 9. So that's a 19-point deficit between Brian Kemp's approval rating and Stacey Abrams' favorability rating. Favorability rating isn't everything, but it's super important to note because if voters like a certain candidate, they're obviously way more inclined to vote for such a candidate. And if they dislike a performance as governor, 2022 is practically right around the corner. Stacey Abrams would be a shoo-in for the Democratic primary and possibly, depending on how the next 2 years go, a shoo-in for the Georgia general election in the state, obviously in the state of Georgia. And then they also asked the question, how do you view the Democratic Party? Now, Democrats don't come out ahead as large as John Ossoff or as large as Joe Biden, but they come ahead by plus 6 points. The voters in the state of Georgia say they approve of the Democratic Party by 6%. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but let's show you the Republican Party numbers. The Republican Party is in the unfavorability rating, a net negative 26. That is a combined 32-point deficit between the Democratic Party's approval and the Republican Party's disapproval. And I want to importantly, tell you that this is super important because the Georgia Republican Party, has partially stood by Brian Kemp and also partially stood by Donald Trump. But there is a very large divide in the Republican Party currently. I expect many of those, solid, hardcore Trump voters saying they disapprove of the current Republican Party because they weren't able to overturn the election results or they upheld the election results, whatever it might be. That's likely what caused, the favorability rating to dip amongst Georgia voters. But one cannot deny that a fractured GOP is beneficial for the Democratic Party. And right now, what we're seeing in Georgia is that voters approve of the Democrats but disapprove of the GOP. And I understand that those who may be disapproving of them will still very likely vote with them, or also, they're just conservative voters, but the disapproval cannot be understated because we're not seeing that same type of level on the Democratic Party. It would make sense if it was happening on both sides. Traditionally, we see disdain for both parties amongst both very partisan, levels. We're talking the left wing and the right wing, but also, now that it's only happening on one side, it's super important to know that there is a big difference, between negative 26 and positive 6. So they also ask questions about Joe Biden, whether or not they think that they are going to, he's going to unite the party. They also ask a number of questions about policy. So they bring up the question of $2,000 checks. They ask about, do you think that they should have $2,000 checks? That's support plus 26%. Now, the question is definitely phrased in a way that you could assume that they're talking about $14,000, not $14,000, wow, $1,400. They say in response to the coronavirus pandemic, should the Biden administration issue another round of stimulus checks to individuals to bring the total to $2,000? Definitely a little misleading, but I would say overall the main takeaway here is that American people need the stimulus check. They want the stimulus check because they know it'll help them. It'll help them through a very troubling time. We're about to hit 1 year in lockdown, even though we haven't really been adhering to that 1 year in lockdown. So Americans are desperate because a lot of things aren't working in their favor right now. While we are on the verge of beating this virus and getting, herd immunity across the United States, I think that it does come down onto Congress to really help the American people. And it's very clear citizens here and around the country, plus 56%. This is the most lopsided poll because voters in Georgia know, Americans in Georgia know, citizens in Georgia know, everything, needs to get done in Congress to help the American people, because we need it. The American people needs help, and it's on Congress to act. So looking at that number, I would say that's probably one of the few things that could bring the parties back together. But also, I want to point out that if this happens under Joe Biden, expect his approval rating to jump. He's currently ahead by 20 points in terms of the popularity rating as to how he's handling his job as president. But if the $2,000 checks or $1,400 checks, release, I can expect the approval rating to jump up considerably. So just letting you know that. But, looking at the data that we've seen so far, major takeaway here is that Donald Trump, Brian Kemp, not liked figures in this state. And those are the two sides of the Georgia Republican Party. I find that very unfortunate for Georgia Republicans because they know, this was a crushing defeat. To going from the, 2 Republican senators and Republican victory for nearly 3 decades to going to the Democrats in 2020 to now having 2 Democratic senators from Georgia. I mean, it's practically unheard of. If I had told you this back in 2018, you probably would have laughed at me because it was just so unbelievable that Georgia would have 2 Democratic senators, now that Arizona would have 2 Democratic senators, and it looks as if these states are taking even more steps to be more left-leaning and taking more steps to separate themselves from their previous GOP status. Because if you actually take a look at the Georgia results back in 2004, the last time a Republican won besides Donald Trump, it wasn't a close victory whatsoever. George W. Bush won the state of Georgia by 17 percentage points. To put this into perspective, in the 2020 presidential election, there were states that were closer than Georgia in 2004. And these were, a number of them, but states that would probably surprise you: Mississippi, Montana, Indiana, Missouri, South Carolina, all closer than the margin of victory for George W. Bush in Georgia in 2004. In fact, this website allows us to compare to compare the previous election. So we go from 2020 and compare it to 2004. Look at that swing in Georgia, a 16.8% swing. Let's compare it to Joe Biden and Barack Obama in 2008, a 5.5% swing. 2012, when Obama won re-election, 8-point swing. Compared it to Hillary Clinton, 5-point swing. So overall, in the state of Georgia, super significant swings no matter what election you're looking at besides 1992, but literally every time since then besides 76 and also 80, because Jimmy Carter was from the state of Georgia. Huge home state appeal. But I just want to point out, Joe Biden did considerably, better in the state of Georgia compared to a lot of his modern day predecessors. And I want to point out that, looking at Georgia, I would say this is a great indicator for the Democratic Party as to how some other states that were surprisingly competitive in 2020 ended up, or how they currently feel about the GOP. And Georgia is a state that Republicans have been and are going to try to target very heavily because they know that they can win Georgia. They've done it in the past. They did it for 28 years. It's very similar to the Rust Belt, which flipped for the first time in 2016. Democrats knew they had won in the Rust Belt for 24, 28 years. They knew it was possible, but they started to lose their grip, and they lost it very considerably in one election, swinging from being a likely state for the respective party down to being a tilt state for the opposition party. It's the exact scenario that happened in the Rust Belt, and I think Republicans are looking at Georgia and saying, we want to win here because we just lost 2 Senate races. Maybe we can win one back in 2022, but also these numbers are telling us, that just simply might not be possible. It might not be possible because of the fact that Donald Trump is disapproved of. And I know that negative 17 number looks very strong, against Donald Trump, but it's about average. It's about average. Nationwide, Donald Trump's in the negative. 57.9%. Let's go ahead and subtract that here. I have a calculator here. So 57.9% minus 38.6, 19.3%. So it's only 2 points more in favor of Donald Trump than the entire country. And I find that very interesting because that really goes to show that Georgia voters do not like the way that Donald Trump treated his presidency. They also do not like the way that Brian Kemp is currently handling the governorship. Now -9 versus Stacey Abrams at +10. That's enough to win her the election. Now, I'm not saying she's automatically going to win because of these approval rating numbers, but it's a very good indicator for the Democratic Party that, despite Joe Biden winning in the state of Georgia and despite Democrats winning both Senate races here, the popularity amongst the Democratic Party has not faded, but has in fact grown because of the, current divide in the GOP, 26, net negative 26%. A lot of Republicans, we can actually find that. How many Republicans currently disapprove of the Republican Party, because it will let us know, what you're looking at is Republicans turning their backs on the Republican Party because they have not been too supportive of President Trump in the state of Georgia specifically, maybe more on the national level, but Brian Kemp and Ryder Raffensperger have certainly stood up to President Trump. But amongst Republicans, just nearly 19% say they have an unfavorable view of the Republican Party, and I think that's definitely those who skew to the right because they, don't like the Republican Party and what they're doing so far, and I think that definitely, hurts the GOP when it comes down to trying to win elections in the future and even winning this election. Because after Donald Trump lost, he tried to say that he won Georgia, he won Arizona, he won Pennsylvania, he won Wisconsin, but obviously to no avail. And, Georgia was front and center because of the runoff elections, a lot of attack ads on GOP candidates, Kelley Loeffler and David Perdue. And I want to point out that, looking at everything that unfolded over the past 3 months, has definitely made Georgia voters turned off from the Republican Party. Voters that had backed them for 28 years straight now disapprove them by nearly the same number in terms of the negative disapprove. So overall, I will say that the GOP definitely doesn't come out positive out of these new Georgia numbers. It's an indicator that 2022 may not exactly be, the best way possible. It's possible for them to recover, but for right now, it's very clear that Donald Trump, Brian Kemp are unpopular figures within the state of Georgia, and they're going to have to do something to change that. They're going to have to do something to win in 2022, something different, because they can't win off the strategy that lost them 2 Senate races in Georgia. They can't win them off the strategy of losing the presidential race in Georgia for the first time in 3 decades. Something has to change in the state of Georgia. The warning signs were there, from 2012 to 2016, despite the entire country shifting to the right, Georgia shifted to the left. So what we saw was, a considerable shift in Georgia, a considerable shift in, compared to 2004, super big shift. So I just wanted to point that out. Georgia was a state that was shifting to the left, definitely should have been caught by the GOP. I guess they didn't think 2020 would be the year where Democrats were able to win the state of Georgia, but it ended up doing so. So all eyes on Georgia, data coming out from the state of Georgia, not necessarily the best news for the GOP. They need to fundamentally change something about how they're campaigning in Georgia and the messaging in Georgia. Otherwise, they likely won't come out of this route where they went from, being the overwhelming dominating party to being in the minority in the Senate, to not winning the state on the presidential level anymore. It really all comes down to what Republicans can do to change the way that Georgians view the Republican Party, and that's going to be the struggle for the next 2 years. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. I apologize for this video coming out pretty late. I'm recording it, very late. It'll probably come out mid 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. I'm sorry about that. Did not mean to do that. Things just piled up today. On the screen is a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.